You'll die out there without a real soldier." The line landed like a blade. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Mercer said it flat and clinical voice tuned to the cadence of screens, while the command post behind him pulsed in cool blues, FLIR overlays, RQ-20 Puma grids, acoustic arrays mapping the ruin into neat geometry. Mara Holt felt the brass of Ephraim's compass warm under her thumb and the diesel tang at the back of her throat. On the monitors. Training Grid Echo 7 was a math problem, white-hot blips cooling to black glass. Rubble reduced to polygons. To the men in the tent, it was data. To Mara, it was a map someone had already written in footprints. She didn't argue. She laid out the handwriting. Her fingertips read the ground, the way others read a ledger split-tread imprints gouged by a dragging heel, a ragged strip of ACU snagged on rebar that told how a body had twisted. Microdrops of blood pinpricked across ash like punctuation marks no sensor could catch. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Mercer jabbed an impatient finger at the thermal overlay. "There's nothing," he said. "We're not sending personnel into an unstable collapse zone on a hunch." Holt's reply was quiet and absolute. "It isn't a hunch. The Earth keeps a ledger, you just need to know how to read it." She named the practice plain ground sign analysis. The phrase made half the tent tilt away. It claimed a language the machines could not translate. Cameras cut between amber close-ups of her hands brushing dust and the cold blue of ISR feeds looping their hollows. On the ground, Mara read currents, how dust folded into a stale breath, how steel and concrete stacked to make small, heat-masked cavities where a body could hide. She traced secondary collapse vectors with her eyes, seeing not only what had fallen, but where voids might shelter life, where the grid saw debris. She saw passages and possibility. A memory tightened behind her ribs, Ephraim in a hollow teaching a 10-year-old to find a rabbit's track by the way the earth leaned. That lesson became a life 15 years as a military police investigator, SAR certifications, deployments where satellites lied, and a person's fate depended on someone who still read the ground. They ran another GPR sweep. Acoustic arrays hummed back silence. Thermal overlays stayed mute. Time pressed at her sternum. Protocol and liability were recited like prayers. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Mercer repeated the rules, but in the margins. The book was being closed on survivors. Mara slid the brass compass into her pocket and looked at the perimeter NCO with the steady certainty that paperwork could not hold. The radio sighed. She announced, measured she was conducting a close reconnaissance authorized on paper, defiant by intent. She squeezed through a 3-foot gap beneath a collapsed foundation. The world narrowed to breath and ash. Her radio spat static. Above, machines maintained their confident calculations. Below, the earth had already begun to answer. She crawled toward the sound. The dust answered with a tiny, ragged breath. "You watching from a base or a backyard, drop your location in the comments. I read everyone. Like this story, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. No blips, no heat, just a breath in the dark." Her lamp sliced a thin lane through ash, while the ISR grid above looped cool blue certainty. Mara moved low. A translator between two languages, one made of sensor geometry, the other of small. Patient disturbances the earth refused to hide. Every step was a hypothesis. Shift a slab. Listen. Press a fingertip to dust. Smell the copper of old blood. Brush ash aside and read the grain of a footprint, where the drones parsed shapes. Mara read intent. Signs arrived in economy tiny, stubborn, impossible to fake. A heel scuff that angled wrong meant someone had climbed instead of walked. A frayed strip of ACU snagged on rebar told which way a body had rolled. Microdrops of blood punctuated the ash like ellipses, marking direction and momentum. She catalogued each without fuss-bearing. Pace. Likely injury. This was not folklore. It was family habit refined into a soldier's trade. 15 years in the military police. SAR certifications. Nights where satellites lied and ground readers saved lives. She threaded the wreck like reading a sentence. Corridors of twisted I-beams funneled her. Concrete ribs created narrow channels. Above, the command post re-ran thermal sweeps until their blue logic made officers breathe differently. Below, the story thickened, reversed airflow in a ventilation shaft. A torn medical label half buried beneath rubble. Scuff marks that steepened into an improvised drag line. Then she found him Sparks. He lay curled inside the hollow of a reinforced hull, metal cradling him like a broken rib cage. Specialist Marco Sparks Martinez opened dull brass eyes and tried to smile through shock. Blood seamed the ground beside him. A scattering of field dressings and SAM splints glinted in the failing lamp. Mara moved without ceremony. Stabilize. Prevent worse. Create a chance. She applied a cat tourniquet where it was needed and packed what could be packed with one hand while keeping watch on the rest of the ruin. Technique was private. Saving was public. "Sparks," she said. He mouthed the name and clung to her sleeve like a tether. "Hold on. Help is coming." She hit her ANPRC 148 style beacon. Sometimes the grid needed a point, a bright dot to vector 2, while radios argued over minutes. The beacon's pulse punched a small, bright mark into the horizon. That was the calculation tactile certainty meeting procedural redundancy. Someone should have seen it and moved. Martinez tried to stand and cursed his legs. Mara steadied him, then vaulted the hull to pick up the tire tracks again. They led toward a foundation littered with collapsed concrete, where wind made an odd pattern air currents that spelled concealed openings. The trail kinked inward, then doubled back. Someone had hauled themselves toward the medical sector, and then slumped where the building swallowed their path. She kissed the cold concrete with her ear and listened. A breath answered thin, ragged, undeniably human. It could be pain. It could be hope. Mara mouthed the two names she carried like prayer beads. Sparks, PFC Lin Chen, and set her shoulders to follow that fracture of air. Deeper in. The ruin began to speak in other ways, a low metallic groan that ran under everything. A settling shift that made dust fall like slow sleet. Her lamp flared. For a single suspended beat, the world was nothing but grit. The metallic tang of diesel. And a heartbeat that might still be someone's. She squared her shoulders, slid into the collapsed throat, and the dark closed like a mouth, every small sign now a thread she would have to pull. "She's the only one who'd read the ground right." The sentence landed like a verdict spoken into the dark. Mara found Brigadier General Elias Voss propped against a fractured concrete pier. Uniform muddied, one boot half buried under a slab. The emergency lamp carved his face into hard planes, dignity folded into ruin. He was awake. Shock had narrowed him thin, but not emptied him, despite the blood and the salt of pain. His gaze held the steadiness of a man still in command. Up close, the wound told its own blunt math, a deep tear along the thigh. Blood feathering into dust in a dark halo that implied arterial involvement. The sight sharpened the world into instruments time. Pressure. The small trades of buying minutes. Mara didn't narrate the science she moved. Practiced and unceremonious. She pressed wads of dressing into place, found a saline lock scavenged from a tossed kit, kept fingers steady where shaking would have killed hope. When she dropped Ephraim's brass compass into his palm, it flashed warm and then steady. He closed his hand around it like a prayer. "You read the land." He rasped two words that were more confession than praise. "Do what you think." The choice froze like a held breath. Evacuate him now, call the birds. Wrestle Rotor Wash into a cratered clearing. Risk losing the two other men deeper in the shell, or honor the old soldier's code that rank does not get rescued first when another still breathes. Voss's voice did not waver. "Find my soldiers first." "Sergeant." The order came not from vanity, but from a ledger he understood one life balanced against two, and a commander who would not be counted alone. It was a moral knot with wires of iron. Mara felt his pulse at the throat, steady enough to hammer the possibility into place. She stabilized him long enough to be trusted to leave pressure. Dressing, a line that bought time rather than promised cure. In that ruined room, the general was a man reduced to soldierly imperative, titles slotted into a smaller truth. She rose on hands that still smelled of diesel and crushed ash. The compass thudded in her pocket like a second heart. She picked up the arc of faint tire impressions again, micro-pressures in the muck that told of a vehicle forced over a lip. A fabric scuff that read like a slow confession. The marks steered her toward a collapsed equipment shelter where air moved oddly tiny eddies that spelled a concealed opening. The stale tang of antiseptic and old blood. At the corridor threshold she crouched and pressed an ear to cold concrete. A breath answered thin, ragged, unmistakably human. Mara mouthed the two names she carried like rosary beads sparks. PFC Lin Chen. She counted them and let the counting set the pace. Then the building spoke not in hope, but in warning, a low metallic groan that ran under the air and sent dust feathering down like slow snow. Concrete settled with a terrible patience, as if the ruin itself were deciding which parts to keep. Mara's lamp flared. For a sliver of a moment the world narrowed to grit, the metallic tang of burned fuel, and a heartbeat that might still belong to someone behind another wall. She glanced back at Voss' compass cupped in his hand. Emergency light painting him an impossible promise, then slid into the passage. The ruin closed around the sound, and every small sign she'd been following became an urgent thread she had to pull. She walked back to the command post into a quiet. Stunned silence applause would come later. After the paperwork and the questions, the tent that had trusted blue screens hours before now smelled of coffee, paper, and the uneasy rustle of people rearranging what they thought they knew. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Mercer watched a replay on a loop, as if repeating the same frame could conjure a different truth. The after-action review that followed read like two genres collapsed together, a courtroom transcript and a field manual. Thermal overlays ran beside Mara's annotated photos. Technicians argued sensor blind spots. Investigators matched heel drags to torn fabric. The evidence did not shout, it stacked. Patient and inexorable. Ground sign analysis no longer fit in the margin. It demanded a place at the table. Institutional machinery did what it always does, measure risk. Assign blame where convenient, and protect capability when it must. Mercer received a formal admonishment and was tasked to lead a protocol review, a public line that standards mattered, and a private line that useful officers were not to be broken. At the same time, the Maneuver Support Center quietly drafted an after-action bulletin. A short addendum to the Search and Rescue Doctrine circulated a chapter that gave language and weight to the thing Mara had been practicing on mud and memory. The bulletin carried a call stamp on a training slide margin. Someone dropped an image of a brass compass like a small, stubborn signature. Recognition came in degrees rather than a single gesture. There was a handshake in the command post, a photograph that migrated from phone to inboxes, a terse line item in an operational email. Then Brigadier General Elias Voss cleaned, bandaged, fitted again into a service uniform he had not expected to wear, stepped into a quieter light. He offered no speech. He pinned an Army Commendation Medal on her chest and, meeting her eyes, said only, "You did the right thing." The moment was not theater. It was an official correction, a stubborn acknowledgement of a truth the screens had missed. Paperwork followed its own slow ritual. Selection packets moved through staff sergeants and majors. Endorsements were signed, and Mara was offered a slot at the Doctrine integration cell with early consideration for Master Sergeant. It was not a coronation. It was a place to do the hard work, translate tacit craft into syllables a bureaucracy could teach without hollowing the craft itself. Mara accepted because the work mattered more than the ribbon. Months later, the change proved utilitarian. At Fort Dalton, a weather inversion flattened thermal contrast into a useless blue. A young lieutenant, given a handful of slides and a stub of Holt's checklist, found 3 simulated casualties by reading heel drags, airflow, and subtle ground cues. Training photos circulated quietly, an instructor squinting into scrub, a compass held like a baton. Brigadier General Voss sent a single-line note from the Pentagon. "Your grandfather's wisdom saved soldiers through you." Back home, the compass lived on the kitchen table like a small, private proof. The Army had amended a manual. Policy moved with the deliberate gravity of institutions. But the quieter shift soldiers, slipping a picture of a brass compass into a pocket, where once only a phone fit, was the change that would outlast memos. Committees took minutes. Muscle memory changed in seconds. And as the tent emptied and the new slides went into servers, the one rule the land had always kept remained the same. It would keep its entries. And someone would have to read them. She kept the compass on the kitchen table like a small, deliberate secret, and let the house hold its breath around it. The medal lived in a drawer she only opened when no one else was home. An Army Commendation Medal. Plain and official. Not the kind of decoration that needed headlines. Photographs from the night moved through official channels, and private phones a thermal overlay beside a close-up of dust-darkened fingers. A training slide with Mara's name in the footer. The Maneuver Support Center's addendum found its way into briefings. Ground sign analysis slid into a digest that would be taught next quarter. On a slide margin, the brass compass looked puny for the credit it had come to symbolize. And yet it carried that credit regardless. Recognition changed details, not habits. The Army amended a paragraph in a manual. Classrooms gained a new module. Mara accepted the slot at the Doctrine integration cell, not for ceremony, but to do the hard work, translate tacit memory into language soldiers could learn without hollowing the thing that made it useful. She taught them to look down, as well as up to notice micro-blood sign, to weigh structural collapse heuristics against sensor feeds, to treat a compass as curriculum rather than curio. The classroom smelled of coffee, paper, and sometimes the faint diesel that clung to her memory. The practical proof arrived quietly. Months later, at Fort Dalton, under a weather inversion that flattened FLIR into useless blue. A lieutenant with nothing but a stub of Holt's checklist found 3 simulated casualties by reading heel drags and airflow. Training photos circulated in a set of discrete emails, an instructor squinting into scrub, a hand holding a compass like a baton. Brigadier General Elias Voss sent one line from the Pentagon. "Your grandfather's wisdom saved soldiers through you." At home, the ritual shifted in small ways. Her daughter learned to fold a map the way you fold a promise, careful, exact. In the barracks, a corporal slid a photograph of a brass compass into a pocket that had once held only a phone. An instructor paused a rainy exercise at Fort Dalton and told the class a story about a woodsman and a girl who learned to listen. They listened, because listening had saved lives. Policy moved in slow. Necessary circles, muscle memory changed overnight. Mara kept teaching the balance, respect the censors, but do not let them replace a reader on the ground. The land kept its own ledger. It did not sign memos. It simply held its entries, legible to those who would crawl into the dark and learn the language of dust and wind. When she walked the perimeter of Echo 7 and set the brass compass on a stump, the needle settled like a promise kept. Sun cut a thin line across its face and, for a breath, the metal flashed like an unspoken vow. Two things held true then, and would hold true after experience, is a weapon only when tempered by humility. And technology is only as powerful as the people who remember to listen to the earth beneath their feet.